Hello, I'm Bob Bradley. This is THE 101, Introduction to Theater and Drama Arts. The subject today is the audience. You the audience. And yes, me the audience, we. Very much me. I suppose I would say one of my favorite things to do is to go to the theater. And somebody asked me rather recently how many times I went in a year, and I really have no idea. I don't know that I've ever stopped to count. But I would say probably somewhere in the neighborhood, if I can possibly manage it, somewhere between 80 and 100 times a year. And I stopped to figure out, hey, that's twice a week. But no, I don't go twice every single week, but there are weeks when I manage to surf it in some way or the other. When I'm in New York, I may, over a 5-day period, see as many as 8 or 9 productions in that period of time, or more if I'm there longer. Or if I go somewhere else, if I go to St. Louis for the weekend, then yes, it's at least usually a couple of productions at that time. So yes, I am a member of the audience. I very much enjoy being a member of the audience. I may be a practitioner, but even more than anything, I enjoy being an audience member and seeing. And I think this is the thing, and you have heard this, and you will keep hearing it, because it is one of the absolute essentials that must be remembered, and that is that the audience is an absolute essential element for the theater. In the theater experience, the audience must be there. The audience must be present. And while there are many things that we can talk about in ways in which the audience in the film or in the movie house, there are similar experiences there that, however, the fact that you are there in no way influences the film. And that is, whether you are there or not there, the film keeps running. If you are at home and you get up and you leave the room, the television set just keeps on playing and has absolutely no recognition, no cognizance that you have even left. I assure you, if you get up out of your seat and you move in the theater, the actors know it. The actors are very much aware of it. In fact, the actors are constantly on stage, whether they give any overt indication of it or not. The actors are intimately aware of the audience reaction, and what is going on. I've gone backstage frequently to see a friend of mine who might have been in the performance, and when I get there, one of the first things, and this happens over and over again, an actor will say is, "Oh, it was a wonderful audience tonight. They did so and so and so and so." Or, as unfortunately also is sometimes the case, they go, "Ah, what an audience tonight. I wondered who was out there," or whatever. So yes, the audience is absolutely essential. In fact, many people say that the theater is what happens. The theater experience is that which takes place between the audience and the performer. We, the audience, are in the presence of the performer. The performer is in our presence. There is a chemistry that happens there. There is, and again, you've heard this several times, and you'll probably hear it any one of a number of other times during the semester, and that is that the actor is a shaman. The actor is a leader, and that the actor then gathers us up, and takes us on an experience. But in order for us to have that experience, we must be there. In order for the audience, in order for the experience to happen, the audience must be there. The critic Walter Kerr once wrote, "It doesn't just mean we are in the personal presence of performers. It means they are in our presence, conscious of us, speaking to us, working for and with us until a circuit that is not mechanical becomes established between us. A circuit that is fluid, unpredictable, ever-changing in its impulses, crackling, intimate. Our presence, the way we respond, flows back to the performer and alters what he does to some degree, and perhaps even sometime astonishingly so, every single night. We are contenders making the play and the evening and the emotion together. We are playmates building a structure. And I think this is what we need to remember, and that is that when we come into this place, that is, into this place together, that we at that point are indeed soulmates. We have come in now to construct an experience. And this is an experience that becomes a group experience. We enter singly in twos or threes. We come in as individuals, but very slowly through something that happens to us as that performance begins, we become members of a group, or even sometimes even before the performance begins, and somehow or the other we begin to lose our specific identity, and we begin then to meld ourselves into a group. I think perhaps one of the most astonishing experiences I have ever had in the theater was when seeing a production of the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of The Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. We all in the audience came into this knowing that we were in for something like about a 9-hour experience. And you go 9 hours, yes, 9 hours. We came in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were in the theater for part 1 from 2 until 6. Yes, there were intermissions in there, but we were in the theater from 2 until 6. And at 6 o'clock, we had a dinner break for 1 hour, and we left the theater building, and we came back then at 7 o'clock, and the part 2 began, and part 2 lasted from 7 until shortly before midnight. And then the show was over, and we came out. But even as we came in that afternoon at 2 o'clock, or before 2, and before the performance began, members of the audience, everybody was sort of already, because we all knew that this was going to be one very long day. But already the actors were, in fact, within the audience space as the individual actor, not as a character, but they are welcoming us into the space, talking to us in the space, letting us become a part of that, already beginning to meld with them in some way or the other. And then slowly, one by one, as it approached 2 o'clock, the actors began to leave the audience space and began to go up on stage, and slowly began to take their place on stage. And the audience began to settle down. But we already had begun to feel that we were a unit. We were something here that we were going to have a very, very special experience. And then the lights went down. We were, for that moment, in darkness. We were at that point now making our transition. We were now becoming an audience member. And then the lights came up, and the full cast was on stage there before us. And then they began speaking, and they immediately began taking us into that world that we were now going to occupy from that point until about midnight, except for the breaks of intermission and dinner. But marvelous, wonderful experience. I always remember as we left, by the time the applause was over and the curtain calls and everything were over, it was a little after midnight. And as I left the theater, there were 2 women in front of me. And one woman turned to the other one and said, you know, if they came out and told me, if you come back into the theater, we're going to start the whole thing all over again, and you can be a part of the audience. The woman turned to the other one and said, you know what I'd say? I'd just say, let me walk around the block once and I'll be right here. And yes, I very fully understood, because I'd have been right behind her, because that was so wonderfully special in the bond that got established, the ability of that cast to take us into the adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. We lost our individuality. We became a group. We became a collective mind that now feels, thinks, and acts differently from an individual in a state of isolation. We sense then an intangible communication that gets established here, a communication that gets established between us and the performer, but also even more between us, and that is between those of us sitting in the audience, and we become then this group. We now begin to sense not only that we are in communication with the performer, but that there is also some kind of communication that is going on between us, the members of the audience, as we create this experience together. We in the audience are all focused on the stage. We're all directly in communication with that, and we become aware that everyone else in the audience is also the same focus, also with the same goal in mind, to establish that communication and to become a part of that totality of the experience. Now, if all of that sounds terribly mystical to you in some way or the other, and you go, oh, now what's he talking about? Actually, it's fairly easy to understand, and that is, it's very easy to take note of this, and that is that there are moments at which there is, from an audience, a unison response. This may happen sometimes when something very unexpected happens, and there's a sudden sort of very audible gasp in the audience. And that gasp just doesn't come from one individual, it comes from many individuals, all at the same time. And we begin to realize that every individual there is having that same experience that we're having. This is a group experience, not an isolated experience. However, and unquestionably, the most visible, or maybe, I guess better than the word visible, the most audible response that one can think of is laughter. And yes, when we all laugh together. And in fact, sometimes we in the audience may even laugh, and we aren't always sure why we're laughing. Maybe we did not completely and fully understand what that particular joke was, but at that point, somehow or the other, everyone else was laughing, and laughter is wonderfully contagious. It is something that spreads throughout an audience. Somehow the audience, suddenly, when one person is laughing or a group of people begin laughing, we all begin joining in some way or the other. I can remember once having seen the English actor Rex Harrison, and it just happened in the particular performance that I was seeing. I was sitting on the front row of the theater. So I literally, my chin was almost on the edge of the stage. And Rex Harrison had a marvelous, wonderful technique, a comic technique, and that is of letting lines sort of dribble out of the side of his mouth. What we call technique, we call a throwaway line. And Harrison had this marvelous, wonderful technique of throwing the line away. Now, I'm sitting here on the front row, and I sort of see this line dribbling out of his mouth, this throwaway line, and immediately I begin this wonderful cut. I began laughing. And suddenly I began to realize that now I can hear this laughter, which I have already begun to enjoy myself, that this laughter is now sweeping through the theater, and that the audience, and this is probably in the neighborhood of about a 1,200-seat house, and there are going to be then, and it was a very full house, so there are going to be another 1,199 people somewhere behind me, some of them up in a balcony, some of them way up high, and the sound of Harrison's voice, without any amplification, by the way. Harrison knew how to do this, a wonderful technique of an actor, how to dribble that line out in such a way it could be heard by me, but that it was also, in the time that it took from travel from the stage all the way to the back of the theater, all the way to the top balcony, could be heard by every member of the audience, and we all laughed. And at that point, we were in unison, and as we began to get it, we all here then were focused together, we were brought together, we had a group experience. I don't know whether any of you have ever been to, and much the same thing can happen, of course, in a movie house, and that is we are in a movie house and something funny happens and everybody in the audience begins to laugh. And so consequently, again, we're having then watching the film, this same kind of group experience here that one can have in the theater. The great difference lies in that the film is not going to know whether we ever laughed or not. I assure you, an actor who is given a funny line on stage is greatly aware of whether you have laughed, the audience has reacted to that or not. But the film doesn't. But have you ever been in a film, have you ever seen a film, and then maybe a year later or whatever, you watched it again when you were at home and you now saw it on your television set. And now as you watch it, the film doesn't begin to seem to be nearly so funny as it was in the movie house. Or you find yourself as those same things, as those things that happen in the film, and you reacted to them in such a way in the movie house with such great enjoyment, with such gusto, with such bursts of laughter, that now nothing, or maybe a faint smile. Well, this is because we are now in isolation, or maybe a companion or two or somebody, or members of our family are with us. But we are now in isolation, and so therefore our response is going to be greatly different from what it is going to be when we are in the midst of an audience. The theater has in recent years tried to capitalize on the phenomenon of the live theater, and that is the fact that the audience and the audience and the performer are brought together in one location to have a live experience, to have actual communication one to the other, to set it up. And we hear the performer, we respond to the performer knows how we are responding. Audiences begin coughing, audiences begin rustling programs. This begins to tell an actor, this audience is getting bored. Yes, there are many different ways in which you may communicate to an actor whether you are aware of it or not. But when we are here together, this is an experience which separates us from film and separates us from television. And certainly in recent years, this has been what much of the theater or frequently the theater has tried to do, as it has tried to find somewhere, how can we in the theater capitalize on this experience? How can we make the audience aware, more aware than just sitting out front and having and the actor and watching and focusing on the performer, what goes on stage? How can we make the audience more aware of the reality of the experience that is happening here? How can we make the audience more aware of the liveness, the quality of the liveness that happens here between the two of us? And so there have been all kinds of things that have gone out. The actor coming out into the audience, the actor being specifically and geographically directly in the midst of the audience, or the character frequently speaking very directly to the audience. Now, this is not a technique which is new in drama. It's a very old technique. We can see it in Shakespeare. We can certainly see it in much of 17th and 18th century plays, but it is a technique that, with the rise of realism toward the end of the 19th century and through a great part of the 20th century, as we develop more and more the rise and the creation of realistic productions on the stage, we dropped many of those techniques. We to some extent, isolated, in this case, we put the performer on stage, we put the audience in the auditorium, and we said, okay, yes, you're in your location, each of you belongs here, and now, audience, you watch, actor performs. But more recently, what we have begun to do is to say, is there some way in which we can make the audience more aware of the fact that they are in the theater, that this is a live experience that is happening here between the two? Is there some way in which we can have the audience with more active participation going on? And there have been a number of productions in the last 10 to 15, maybe 20 years or so, in which there have become actual audience participation events in some way or the other. There is the musical called Edwin Drood, wherein the musical arrives at a point toward the end of the second act, and there's been all kinds of things set up, direct relationships set up between the stage and the performer. But in this case, we arrive at this point in the second act, and at that point, everything stops. Now, what this is based on is, the musical is based on an unfinished novel of Charles Dickens, and so called The Mystery of Edwin Drood. So when we get to this point in the musical where Charles Dickens' unfinished work stops, the musical also stops at that point, and now it turns to the audience and says, all right, you decide. You make up your mind, and then they give you several choices as to who could have done what. And there's an actual voting that takes place. And after the audience gets through voting, then whichever one that the audience has selected for that particular evening, the actors then play it out. And yes, depending on which performance you see, and yes, depending on how the audience voted that particular night, you can see several different endings for that particular musical. And there are others. There's a production called Tony and Tina's Wedding. In this particular case, Tony and Tina's wedding starts actually in a church. And you audience members, and you've bought tickets to this, by the way. This is you have bought your tickets, and as you come in the church door, your ticket is taken from you, and you're then shown to your seat in the pew. And it happens, the whole wedding takes place. You are the family members, the guests, who have come now to the wedding of Tony and Tina. And then, lo and behold, we get through the wedding. We finish the ceremony, and at that point now, everybody picks up trucks out of the church, and we go to a nearby restaurant. And we then have the wedding dinner. And yes, you actually sit there and you eat dinner, and then we begin to find out there are all kinds of things that begin to happen. Tony and Tina begin to get into a fight, and various family members begin. Now, all of this, of course, is scripted. But at the same time, there are points at which then they get the audience involved here in some way or the other. Now, all of this, of course, is done for the entertainment value that one has here. And of course, what is done, and this becomes marvelously entertaining for all the people in the audience, because we actually find ourselves being participants in this. There is a point at which perhaps this can be taken too far, and where it is everyone's own individual decisions. But certainly every artist who is creating a performance always needs to remember that an audience needs what we sometimes call aesthetic distance. Now, aesthetic distance is something that every artwork needs, and that is there is some kind of and distance here does not necessarily imply geography, that is a specific length that we need to be such an actual length in some way or the other. The distance here can be mental as well as actual physical in some way or the other. But there is a point at which an audience needs always to be removed enough from what is going on from that particular work of art, that they are removed enough from it that they can perceive the whole, that they can perceive the totality, that they can perceive what is going on, retain some objectivity in some way or the other. Maybe one way of thinking about this is think about looking at a painting. And if you are with your nose almost up against that particular painting in some way or the other, yes, you are very close, and yes, at that point, you may see things, the very flecks of paint that you could not see otherwise, but at that same point, you also lose the perspective of what is this painting. You lose the perspective of the totality of what it is that this painting is. And then at this point, you now take a geographic distance back, but in so doing, you also take a mental step away, and at that point then you can begin to see the totality of what it is. You can begin to absorb the whole of the painting. Well, the same thing is true then of the creation in the theater, and that is we always need to remember that there is a point at which an audience needs to have a distance from what they are doing. Now this, in the theater, it is frequently a mental distance, but that there is a point at which we need the audience to have that aesthetic difference that gives them an objectivity to see and to be aware of the workings of the performance, not just to be so caught up in the events themselves that they lose their objectivity, they lose their balance in some way or the other. This leads to, and that is that the creation of the event, the artistic creation of the event, belongs to the performer. And the performer then guides you through that, guides you through that experience, or guides you through creating the experience in some way. The actor Julie Harris has described this as and that is the relationship between the actor and the audience as the same relationship between the bullfighter and the bull. And that is that the bull comes into the ring and the bull knows nothing at that point. The bull doesn't understand what it is that he is supposed to be doing. He does not understand what it is that is happening. And so at that point, the bullfighter must begin to educate him. The bullfighter must begin to, in some way or the other, create and set up in such a way that the bull will begin to respond. So thus the use of the cloak, thus the use of the color red, because the color red attracts the bull. The bull is attracted to it. The bull now begins to understand what it is that he is supposed to be doing, and he charges toward that red color or whatever. The same thing then happens in the theater. The actor must guide the audience, but the audience must be willing to be guided. There are obligations then of the audience. There are obligations that we all have as we come in. The obligation to be members of the audience. And I guess first we need to arrive, and we need to arrive at least in enough time so that we are there before the event begins. We must arrive and we must prepare ourselves to enter into the event. In other words, we come into the theater, we come out of our lives, we come through a lobby, we enter into the theater, we then find our seats, and we take our seats, and at that point, we must begin our sort of disengagement that we have from the world that we are in at that point, the world that we have left behind us. We have left our world and our reality, and we are now entering into the theatrical world. And so we must allow ourselves that disengagement. We must begin to prepare ourselves to enter into the event. 2, we should certainly, in that disengagement, bring our imaginations. Yes, bring our be ready to open our imagination. Be ready then to open ourselves to the experience. Be ready to become engaged with our imagination in the experience that the actor is going to create for us. Now, we also at the same time have to be aware we have our biases, we have our prejudices, we have our own personal beliefs in some way or the other. And that not necessarily within this world that we are going to enter are we going always to find events that are going to agree with us. We may see events that we don't find readily acceptable, that is in our own world. But remember, we have now entered the world of the theater. We have now entered the fictive world that is being created here, and we at that point should put aside insofar as we possibly can, and it is something we sometimes have to work at. We need to put aside our biases, our prejudices, and our own beliefs. Maybe you have never seen two people of the same sex kiss each other romantically. Maybe, in fact, you even disapprove of this. But you've got to remember, this is not your world that we at this point are in. This is not your reality that we are dealing with. You have now entered that reality, and then you need to bring your understanding. You need to bring and to see why is this happening between these two individuals. This is very different from your world, and so be prepared when you come into the theatrical world for yourself to be challenged, for yourself perhaps to find that what is happening on stage is not what you would want to do or what you even approve of. And just because the fact that you're watching it in no way should indicate that you necessarily believe in that. But at this point, you are now number 4, you have now entered fully into the fictive world. This is not your world. This is not you. You have, and the term that is frequently used here is willing suspension of disbelief. Willing suspension. In other words, you have made a decision here. I am because I want to have this experience, I am willingly suspending my disbelief. And it is by the suspension of that disbelief that you can begin to find and enter into many things and to have many different kinds of experiences that you may never have in your own world. Entering this fictive world does not indicate that you approve or disapprove. In fact, you certainly always need to learn to make a separation of the two. And also, never to make the mistake that frequently happens, and that is that somehow or the other, the role that an actor may be playing as a character on stage is who that actor is. This isn't true at all. An actor is acting the role. The actor is giving and accepting the character. And in fact, when the actor makes a choice of accepting a role, and once an actor has given his or her consent, yes, I am performing this role, then at that point, the actor embraces the character fully. The actor does not disapprove of what the character is doing, because to disapprove of what the character is doing would mean that the actor is not entering fully into that which is what the actor is doing. It in no way means that the actor believes in or that the actor accepts what is going on, but the actor is now doing what it is that he or she is being paid to do, or whatever is the manner of that performance, but that at that point they are entering into it in such a way. Yes, an actor may murder somebody on stage. That in no way implies that an actor is a murderer, or that the actor is going to go out after the performance is over and murder someone out there in real life. That is not, the actor knows this is not going to happen, but when the actor is in the midst of committing that murder on stage, at that point, the actor understands why the character is doing it, what the character is doing it, and enters fully into that and embraces that in some way or the other. To do any less would be to shirk the duty of being an actor. Kathleen Turner once told me a story when she was in the soap opera called The Doctors, which is where she was in the early days of her career before she made her first appearance on a Broadway stage, and she was in a soap opera on NBC television. She played a character named Nola, and Nola was a vamp, and Nola was indeed someone who enjoyed going around and breaking up other people's romances and happy homes or whatever when Nola found someone, a man that she perhaps desired. And so one day they had finished shooting the episode, and so Kathleen left the studio and went out on Fifth Avenue and was walking down the street, and somebody walked up to her and said, aren't you Nola in The Doctors? And Kathleen, at that point being young and very unknown, was rather pleased that somebody, well, she said, why, yes, I am. And at which point, this woman who had walked up to her was holding an umbrella, and she began beating her around the shoulders and saying, you stop being mean to whoever the other character was. And Kathleen literally had to run down the street to disengage herself, to remove herself from this woman. This particular woman could not make a distinction and confuse the two completely. That in no way necessarily was Kathleen the character that she was on stage, or in this particular case, in the soap opera. So we must then we have a willing suspension of disbelief, but we also, at the same point, in having this willing suspension of disbelief, we also then, at the point the experience is over, and maybe this would really be a point number 5, we then return to our reality. And that is we go through a disengagement, the applause. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I think a curtain call on stage is so very important, because it is a particular ritual which, although most people in the audience never think about it, it is a point at which then the audience begins to see the actor as actor, not as performer. And I suppose it's also one of the reasons I very much believe in curtain calls, where it is the performer that one sees. It is the actor one sees. It is not the character. And that when the actor takes that bow, then at that point, there are two or three things that are happening in this experience. One, we are in the audience now showing by our applause. We are showing the actor that how much we appreciate the job that that particular performer has done, how much we have enjoyed that particular performer. But it is also in so doing, that act is for us a point of disengagement. It is wherein we begin to remove ourselves from the fictive world. We begin then to return, make the journey back into our own world, and we get up from our seats and we leave the auditorium and we walk through the lobby and we're in the street and we are now back in our own reality. So therefore, maybe a step 5 here is the disengagement that we need to go through and realize, and coming back to our own reality, which leads us to our 6th obligation, and that is, as a part of that disengagement process, then we also need to learn to be critical. Now, the word critical is sometimes misunderstood, or that is, we use it so often these days to mean that we're going to be negative. This is not what the word critical in its true meaning should indicate. Critical means to criticize, and not in a negative sense, to analyze, that's a better word, to analyze, to think about the experience. So what we need to do then is to learn to analyze, to think about, as we are disengaging ourselves, to begin perhaps talking about this, if we came with a companion or someone, to in some way or the other begin to analyze what is it that we saw, to in some way or the other begin to think about what it is. What did we see? And then try to articulate, that is, to begin to be able to verbalize what it is that we have seen. So, in some way, we begin to analyze. We begin to be objective about what we see. We, in some way or the other, want to go beyond the immediate emotional reaction of, well, I liked it, or I didn't like it. We want to go beyond that point. We want to go, and perhaps we can just say, why? Just start with the very simple, if you liked it, why did you like it? Now go back and explore, why did you like it? What is it that made you feel that way? Or if you didn't like it, then again, the same. Explore why. What is it here that somehow or the other that you didn't like? Why was that particular experience that way? As you may have noticed, we've switched locations here, and it's entirely appropriate, perhaps, that we finish this lecture on the audience in the location in which we become an audience. We are in a theater, and I am sitting in a theater seat. So as we talk about how we are an audience and how we want to think, then we have come to this location. I want to propose to you that there are 3 questions that you might think of as you try, after you leave the performance, after you have finished the experience you have had, then at that point, as you go out, there are perhaps some questions that you might ask yourself that would perhaps help guide you in your thinking, help guide you to organize your thoughts. These were questions that were proposed by Johann von Goethe, a German poet, philosopher, playwright, and yes, man of the theater, 18th century. And he, at that point, as he was formulating theater performances and how to think about them, he came up with these three questions. One, what is the play or production trying to do? Two, how well was it done? Three, was it worth doing? These are three rather simple questions, but frequently will require complex answers. Let's take them one by one and talk about them a little bit more. What is the play or production trying to do? Different productions have different intents, different aims, different goals, different purposes, different expectations of what they want the audience or what a particular production wants an audience to think. So don't go to every theater performance or film, as far as that goes, and expect for it to be the same thing. There are many different kinds of film. There are many different kinds of theater productions. And each time that you see one, then you need to start with, what was this particular production trying to do? How was it different from other productions I might have seen, or maybe how is it similar to other productions I have seen? Determine then what is the reason for its particular existence. Two, how well was it done? Okay, notice that actually what this particular question asks is descriptive. And that is, at this point, it's asking us in the audience to now think about how well did the various theatrical elements contribute to or detract from what was done. In other words, we're asking ourselves to describe, to remember, to think about it. Did the acting enhance the script, or did in somehow or the other the acting detract from it? Did the acting get in the way? And yes, sometimes acting can get in the way, so that one really can't get to the script that lies behind those words. Was the scenery appropriate? Much of what you have learned, or we hope will learn in this course, is an attempt to help you understand question number 2. Finally, number 3, was it worth doing? Okay, notice here we have now actually arrived at judgment. We have actually arrived at a point where we're asking you, yes, now talk about and think about your subjective reactions. Now is the time when you can make some appropriate decision. And perhaps if you have gone through these first 2 questions that we posed fairly well, then at that point you can indeed be beyond the question of I don't like it or I did like it. You can perhaps begin to be more critical in terms of the analysis of what you saw and what happened to you while you were a part of that. This next part of the lecture is, I feel somewhat, I can't even say the word, chagrin at doing this, but it seems that it is time that we need to talk about behavior of the audience. This has seemingly become more and more a problem in the modern day. We seem to have people who don't have an understanding of what it means to become a member of a group, or to distinguish between the kinds of events at which a particular individual is at. Behavior that you might have watching a television show in the privacy of your home is perhaps quite different and should be quite different from the behavior you're going to have watching a film or attending a theater event. What you do in your home is one thing, and you are perhaps disturbing no one else because you may be the only one, or perhaps maybe only a couple of other people who may be there with you. But once you go into a public event, then you are entering something different. And this behavior which you're going to have in, whether it be the theater or watching a film, is indeed different from attending a basketball game or some other kind of sports event. While, yes, I can certainly hope that the excitement and the enthusiasm that you might have in watching that sports event can also carry over and become a part of what happens when you are at the theater, but your overall behavior is going to be different. You are in a different kind of group. You are in a different kind of experience. Yes, when you're at a basketball game, you are there to be a supporter of the group. You are there to root for your particular team. While you are in the theater, that is not the same reason for coming to the theater or to watch a film. You have come to the theater to have a different kind of experience. You have come to the theater to have an aesthetic experience, to have an artistic experience, and that requires then that you use a different set of reactions from what you might have if you are in a sports event. Let's make some just rather general statements. For going to the theater or going to see a film, get to your seat before the event begins and stay there until a proper break occurs, such as in the theater you will have an intermission. Yes, we all know emergencies may occur, and maybe for that particular reason you have to get up and leave. But it should be, when you get up and leave, it should be an emergency. Because you should be aware that every time that you get up and you move, you're going to be disturbing individuals. You're going to be disturbing the individuals who are on either side of you. You're going to be disturbing the people who are in the row that you're sitting in, and you're probably going to be disturbing the people who are behind you. So you should begin to limit greatly the amount of moving around you might do at that point. 2, do your talking before the event begins. Once the event starts, once the curtain goes up, once the film starts showing, then at that point, keep the focus on what's happening on stage, not on conversing, not on still talking to your friends in some way or the other. There's a very famous story where Katharine Hepburn, the film actress and theater actress, had returned to the stage after a long absence. And the play began, and she was on stage, and she began talking, and she began hearing something. And this talking seemingly continued, and she realized it was a couple of people sitting up in the mezzanine who were continuing to talk even though the play had begun. This continued for at least a couple of minutes, to the point where she finally herself stopped the scene, marched straight downstage, looked up into the mezzanine and said, "When your conversation is finished, I'll continue the one here on stage." The entire audience in the theater burst into applause. Turn off your cell phone, your pager, or whatever other device you may have brought here. Have respect for what is happening. Have respect for the actors on stage. Have respect for the people around you. I have an actor friend of mine who told me a story that about a year ago he was acting, and he was on stage, and it was after intermission. and about 10 minutes into the second act, and a phone went off. And this is nothing unusual. It continues to happen. And so at that point, the scene just continued on. But at that point, he became aware at the periphery, he could see a woman on the first row had reached down. She pulled her phone out. She did not cut it off. She actually lifted it, said hello. She then proceeded to answer the question, "Oh, I'm in the theater." She told what she was seeing, and then comes the kicker, because it is obvious the person on the other end said, "Well, how is it?" And her answer was, "Eh." I assure you, the actors on stage heard this, as well as most of the other people in the audience. Somehow or the other, we have to get away from our egocentric, boorish behavior that many people seem to exhibit these days when they go to a public event. When you come into the theater, you're given a program. Learn to read the program. The program is going to give you essential information about who wrote the play, who is in the play, who has been responsible for it, and also such things as the setting, the time, and various other essential information that would perhaps help you understand a little better than you might have before what is going on stage. The process of responding to a performance is complex and delicate. You must remember, we lose our individuality. We become a part of a group. We are in a social experience, but we are also very much in an artistic one, an aesthetic one. We are there to react to it. And also remember, of course, that we are there now when we're in the live theater. We are a part of the creative process. We are the completers of that process. We are the ones who finish that process. So therefore, we have now entered into a creative act ourselves by becoming a member of the audience, by becoming a member of this group which is interacting to create the completion of the event, the completion of the theater artistic event that we have come to see. We are now partners in this process, and we must remember that we must act our part as well as the actors who are on stage acting their part.